Mariah from Sci4ma for hosting today.
Hello, everybody. I just want to give a heads up that Chris and I are not in the same location. So while I like to do these in the same location so that we can go smoothly, Chris and I are not in the same location. So if you see any flaws, just bear with us. We will try to handle them as effectively as possible. And also with the Q&A that we'll do generally at the end if we can. So thanks, everybody. Chris, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Mariah. Okay, we'll get going. So first, I guess a little bit about myself. So I'm in Brisbane, and I have degrees in various fields, including education, psychology, and organisational learning and development. A number of qualifications and credentials in project and portfolio management. For the last 9+ years, I've been involved in setting up and just continuously improving enterprise PMO at Marta Group in Brisbane. Well over 20 years working in the project field. But fundamentally, I'm an observer of human behaviour. And they're the things that kind of bring me to the point of offering some of my observations and insights today. That lovely photo there is anyone who knows the Brisbane area. That's the rotunda at Newstead House, overlooking the Brisbane River and Breakfast Creek. And that's my bike. I get to go and hang out in gorgeous places, especially on a Sunday morning. So that's one of my great loves. I'm going to take you through a bit of an overview of today's session. It's one of those, I guess, a brave step for a presenter to try and present multiple strands and then bring it together. But we're going to explore 3 different strands of thought or conversation, and then I will unify that and explain where I sort of feel like the PMO has some great leverage to bring value. So first of all, we'll consider some of the forces that influence organisational decision-making culture. We'll then explore some individual and group characteristics, and I'll focus in on a couple of those that are quite relevant for the PMO world. Then look a little bit at the project and portfolio layers of governance. And then what I'll do is bring those 3 independent strands together to talk about how the PMO or program leads, etc., can use process to change and have positive influence on that organisational, particularly the decision-making culture. And fundamentally, it should be about bringing greater realisation of benefits and the overall value of the PMO. So let's get going. So this is not based on any sort of great formal sort of theoretical research that I want to necessarily relate to. This is more the coffee shop theory. So we're looking at, within an organisation, our organisational culture, we have the forces of people, environment and process. And they all interact and have influences on each other. So I'm just going to sort of step through and talk about each of those in a bit more detail. So first of all, the culture, particularly the organisational decision-making culture. These are about the values and behaviour. It's about how people function within the organisation. It's that thing that's really noticeable when you change jobs. It's that how we do it here factor. You know, when you step into a new role or a new organisation or a new industry, and you discover that how things are approved or agreed to or managed are fundamentally different. Even simple things like how you request leave from your boss. And they will then influence sort of how things proceed. Okay. So the environment can be many complex things. So it's that physical environment, your actual sort of very tangible environment around you. You know, the political environment, the geographic environment, economic, the demographic, seasonal, technological, has gotten extraordinary. If you think back 10 years ago and how you functioned in an organisation then, compared to now that we have more mobile technology, and it's opened up a lot more flexibility about how we function. Some would say maybe not in the best way because we're now contactable, you know, potentially 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So the nature of work has changed from the industrial era of, you know, time card in and out. That affects how we function within an organisation. The people, I want to talk a little bit about 2 layers here. We have both individuals and groups, so let's just explore those a little bit more. So first of all, individuals. You know, we're familiar with how we all are. We are generally different. We've heard about things like Myers-Briggs, potentially team role kind of functions. Some interesting things that people are generally motivated differently. Some interesting theory to look into, if you're interested, is within the field of neuroscience. There's a good model called the SCARF model. And I found that really useful because it helps me understand that some people are really quite status driven, whereas I'm someone who's very driven by equity and social justice. So when I'm interacting with someone who's quite status driven, I've learned to change how I message and interact with that person so that I communicate in a way that they best receive a message. So I'm not creating tensions or putting up barriers in that communication. So we all function differently. Generational, absolutely, very significant. So if I reflect, my parents were of a much older generation. They're both left us now, but they grew up during World War II and Depression. And that greatly influenced how they made decisions for the rest of their lives. It influenced how they invested, very risk averse, very protective of any resources, any money that came in, very careful. My mum's sister, for example, in her later years when she was in hospital, would save the paper that the drinking straws came in case she needed it for notepaper. So it's, you know, I think a lot of our risk appetite in many ways is set by the experiences that we have in our first 10 to 20 years. So across our age span, a greater age span now in the workforce, so that certainly influences across individually. The two that I really would like to touch on here, objectivity bias and confirmation bias, I think I'm going to highlight these because they have a significant influence in decision making and how we undertake that within our project world. So objectivity bias is where we tend to believe what we believe, and we become very positive and passionate about the things that we believe are correct, and we look for you know, sort of those things that kind of then confirm that, so that these two start to feed together. So I see this particularly when someone's working up a business case and they believe that what they're presenting is the best and correct thing to do. So it starts to skew the arguments. So the various options, you'll find that the one that the writer or the sponsor, etc., most positively believes in will have the most positive skew to shape or influence that decision making. So that's something that I'll particularly note that I think we can work with. So it's just understanding that is how we tend to function. The other is the confirmation bias, where we tend to notice things that affirm or confirm the things that we believe. So if I'm, you know, particularly talking about the project context, and I'm delivering something, I will notice the evidence that shows that I believe tells me we're heading on the right track. And I'm more likely to kind of not consciously acknowledge things that start to chip away at that belief. It's a bit like when you're thinking about buying a new car and you're thinking about buying that red one with the sports wheels, and you start to see that model everywhere. You become very aware of what you're looking for, and you're less likely to notice the things that you're not looking for. And it's interesting how you'll start to kind of maybe ignore the reviews that give a little bit of a negative about that thing that you've decided you want to buy. So that's, again, those two pieces we'll pull back to fairly soon. I just want to touch on this. You've probably heard the theories or the conversation around corporate psychopaths. You know, I'm kind of pulling back a bit from that because generally a psychopath is someone who's not functional. But these people, these corporate red dwarfs, generally function. But if you look at that you know, description of what a red dwarf star is, their erratic behaviour could make life unpleasant, if not impossible, for PMO worlds. So there's two key types of corporate red dwarfs that I've observed, and I'll be keen to hear if people can kind of, I certainly don't want names, but if you can identify across your work-life experience where you've seen this. So the first type are the ones that have great ideas and are very enthusiastic and get people started, but then before there's been any ability to deliver on that, they've shifted direction to the next great idea. So their erratic behaviour makes it very hard to follow through and actually deliver something. So they're a challenge. The other type of red dwarf, general kind of grouping, I'd say are those that function very independently, don't collaborate, don't leverage off each other and work together towards shared goals. So I don't have fantastic theories about how to address these, apart from potentially understanding how they work and what motivates them, and being terribly cautious if you end up with either one as your sponsor. So just putting that little theory out there, I think many of us could probably reflect on individuals we've needed to work with over the years. I'll be keen to come back to that when we get to questions later. All right, within groups, so we're just talking about individuals and some fundamental individual behaviour. And again, I'm not going to go into huge depth. There's so much literature out there around group behaviour and group dynamics. But they certainly, the behaviours of the individual do influence the behaviour of the many or the group. But it's just interesting watching how different groups start to form their own normal culture and behaviour. And that we all tend to function a bit differently within a group setting than when we're working in a more informal individual or small group setting. I will highlight cultural norms are very significant. When I'm talking about cultural norms, I'm particularly talking about across regions of the world. There are cultures where it is very rude to challenge and to in any way undermine any of your colleagues. And then there are other cultures quite the opposite, where it's incredibly normal to be confronting and challenging in professional ways, but also could vary. Now, having said that, that could be quite widely geographically variable. I've seen those extremes exist here within Brisbane in two different organisations. One where it's normal within their culture for senior executives to not challenge each other at the group table. They do not raise objection or interact or so really dive into the detail and play around. And again, when I'm saying challenge, I'm not necessarily meaning I'm encouraging attacking individuals, but concepts and ideas. We don't sort of really do that. Whereas again, in Brisbane, in another organisation, semi-related industry or sector, it's very different, where it's very normal for each of the players at the exec to really, sort of critique each sort of proposal and idea. So it's fascinating, and it's important to understand how your organisation functions, and sometimes then it may be around the meetings outside of the meeting and how you influence individuals to then have conversations at the table. But it's a fascinating thing to sit back and observe. I've been in a wonderful position at MARTA where one of the nice things about when you get to write frameworks and policies, you can kind of design them in a way that helps you. And one of the things I wrote into ours was that I sit as a non-voting member of all the steering committees for large capital projects, which gives me the chance to role model the kind of senior level questioning and to support those projects, but it also gives me a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to sit back and observe and understand how people at the various levels do interact and what drives them. I'm very conscious of listening to the language that they use and what's important to them to make sure that our project messaging also meets that kind of communication. I've noted there are things like conformity. It is, groupthink. It's fascinating to watch how people at the table do start to kind of shift their beliefs to a single. I mean, you do need generally to reach a consensus, but it is absolutely interesting. I've known people to go to a meeting all with a fairly unsupportive view of a concept, and yet none of them wanted to be the first person to raise a challenge to that concept. And they all went away unhappy that this thing had been supported because no one actually sort of stood up and said something. And yet privately, there was almost no one that was in support of it. So it's a phenomenal thing to watch happen with really intelligent, capable, articulate people. So we're all, no matter what level we're at, we're all subject to those kinds of interesting underlayers of how those groups function. I put at the bottom there self-interest versus greater good. I'm in a wonderful place in terms of working with people that are genuinely interested in the social justice that's part of the non-profit organisation that I'm in. but I've certainly worked in places where that self becomes quite prevalent. And it's not that it doesn't exist here, where people don't want to be seen to be presenting something that is open to a lot of critique or has fallibility. They don't want to be the executive sponsor that comes back and says, you know what, I got it wrong. This isn't going to give us value. Let's stop this project. That's hard. That's a hard sort of element to play out. All right, now let's have a look at process, which is really the world of the PMO. I think it's our strong point. I believe it's our greatest point of leverage to be able to influence back on people, environment, particularly organisational culture. So what I'm going to suggest is we design process with an awareness of our people, our environment, and particularly our organisational culture. And I'll kind of demonstrate that more in a moment. All right, let's now shift into the next strand where I'm just going to touch on kind of the portfolio life cycle or the governance layers. So if we start at the beginning, and I've called the whole thing portfolio life cycle, different places use different language. It might be the investment life cycle or the SIM or the strategic investment management governance. Whatever it is at your organisation that takes strategy, then through to individual ideation, the ideas and selection, initiation, etc., right through to a post benefits realisation and hopefully feedback our learnings and outcomes back to the ongoing strategy setting. So project governance generally focuses from about initiation through to the close and handover. Program governance has a slightly wider line of sight, and the portfolio investment organisation-wide governance has a much wider line of sight. So the next slide, I'm just removing, all I've done is remove the program governance layer, because I just want to talk about these two. Program governance kind of has things in common with both of these. Let's just talk about, these are common characteristics of a project governance level. These are not always true, these are just generalizations. So the focus of the project governance, and reasonably rightly so, is very much focused on the actual project and less on the wider organisation and ongoing. The emphasis of the conversation shifts to the deliverable, so whatever the project is about. The business case is treated as a certainty. That is, if you build this, we will get these outcomes. It's kind of a passive approach to that governance, and we'll talk more about testing that. This is where we start to see objectivity and confirmation bias. A lot of this is influenced by how the project manager then communicates to their project governance board or steering committee, where we are constantly testing and looking for things that show that this works. And I'll come back and again, it'll be part of the process that I propose. The horizon of the conversation is very much dominated by the go live, the deliverable, when we pass it over to the business, and not always on the long-term outcome or benefits. It's very easy to lose the ability to have a conversation about the impact on benefits. Again, I know some organisations do this really well. This is the generalisation. And individuals, their individual roles are often dependent on delivering a project. This is particularly true where you're using contingent workforce. So you have project staff who are engaged on contract or temporary to deliver that particular project. It then becomes very challenging for them to raise their hand and say, hey, I have concerns, I don't think this project needs to continue, it won't give you value. So we need to help them manage that kind of conflict. It's also the individual sponsor, or the owning executive and business owner. They may feel their role or their KPIs are at risk if they don't deliver the project with less focus on the project outcome. So what I'm saying is it's not necessarily wrong, I'm just suggesting we need to make sure we balance or counterbalance this focus. Now if we shift to that much higher level view of portfolio governance characteristics, fundamentally their focus should be on the whole business value and capability building in future. They're less concerned with technical detail about individual projects. And generally, they're more objective. So there's that degree of separation that helps them be a little less emotionally connected, a little less looking for that confirmation bias that shows that they've picked the right projects to deliver their portfolio of goods. And they're increasingly less familiar with the actual content or expertise. So that's true. The higher up you go, so for example, at your board or the most senior level of governance, often they come from completely different sectors. So we need to be communicating and working with them in good, intelligent, plain English. That's quite important. So these are fundamental characteristics of a good portfolio governance layer. I presented essentially this at the PMO Symposium in San Diego recently, and I had a number of polling questions. And one of the questions I asked at this point was, how many organisations have a good line of sight from strategy formation right through that whole chain to full realisation or review back to strategy? And maybe 20% of organisations felt that they had that robustly in place. Then there was maybe another 20-25% that felt like they had, some degree. But, it was probably a good half had no clear end-to-end process. So I think that's one gap that can be tackled. All right. So we've gone through the various forces of people and processes and culture, etc. We've talked a bit about this governance line. So what I'm now going to do is start to bring it together. So let's have a look at how we can start building in some key questions into our process. So if we look down here, I'm suggesting that within whatever your governance process is, whether you're using gates, etc., however you word your reporting and planning templates, and even just your own conversations, if you start using some of these concepts within any of that, I think we can kick things up a bit. So this is about counterbalancing that human fallibility, where we continue to deliver things that perhaps we shouldn't. So first question really should be, is this a great project? And then is it the right project to deliver strategic capability? So not every great project is one that we really should proceed with. Then what does that project look like as part of an entire portfolio? So what we don't want is most of our portfolio, or most of our projects, maybe not delivering value for 5 years, because that next 5-year gap is a bit scary. We probably don't want everything also delivering within the next 12 months unless there's some particular imperative. We need to understand the level of impact and what part of the strategy it's delivering and so on. Also, what's the risk? So the value of that project or that investment versus the likelihood we can succeed. I probably don't hear this conversation as much as, as project people, we're pretty good at looking at our different project ideas and working out sort of what are the risks of that project being able to deliver. But as an organisation, how good are we at saying, look, that project idea, that investment, that's something we haven't done before. So I'm going to consider that as a high risk because we don't know if we can deliver that. This is pretty greenfield for us. And then if I was an investor, I'd say, look, this is kind of risky. It has some good return, but I want a really good return to make it worth me taking this on. I think that's an important conversation. Also, are there parts of the strategy overlooked? Certainly, there's some really good cases out there, if you go do a bit of Dr. Googling, where an organisation has set up a wonderful looking strategy and they've barreled along, but they haven't stopped to look at, let's say they had 5 key arms, they haven't stopped to look at how much of their investment is supporting each of those 5. So they delivered 4, but had put no investment in the 5th, which meant they really didn't have the capability to use what they'd created. And it pretty much crippled. There's a few organisations that kind of fell over because of that. Another question is, what are we not doing if we spend money here? So what's their opportunity? And what's the opportunity cost? Key one, do objective people agree with the proposal? So again, and many of us do it when we're working up a business case or a rationale or a concept, we start to kind of argue for what we see as being the approach. This is where it's very important to bring in people who do not have the same emotional connection. whether it be an external body that validates, and I know some of you probably do this really well, I know some industries do, but it's an extremely important one to then sort of place it over to someone who doesn't have skin in the game, to then say, you know what, I'm not sure about, I think you're missing some assumptions here, or did you consider this other potential option that maybe will give you 80% of the outcome for, 10% of the outlay? And also having a good conversation about whether we actually agree with the assumptions. All right, let's move on. So as we're looking at initiation, again, we should still ask the question, is this still the best thing we can be doing with our investment dollar? Now, while it's right close to that ideas selection, some organisations, some industries may have a 3-5 year capital plan, and it could be a good bunch of years down the track before they start the initiation on an individual project. The world can change significantly. If you are working in an industry that's very subject to the changes within the political climate, whether it be federal or state or local, a machinery government change, a new body into the seat of power can change things significantly, but as can the economic environment. So something like the Brexit has had very interesting impacts on especially some global companies. I was chatting to some folks from Boeing and also another global company, Cargill, and they're quickly rewriting a lot of their contracts to make sure they're all in euro, because they had a lot of things that were in pound. So it shifts things and it makes us quite vulnerable. So always looking out and saying, what's changed since we said this is a great idea to kicking off? Is it still a great looking project? And always asking ourselves, as we go along the life of a project, we learn more and more. So we should keep asking ourselves, do we still believe the output or the deliverable will give us the benefit or the value or the outcomes that we're seeking? How do we both prove and disprove ourselves? And this one is I think, quite key. We go about doing all sorts of testing and assurance processes that prove that we think we'll get what we want, but we don't look for the thing that could disprove us. So in the world of science, you can never actually prove anything. You can test something over and over and over, and you can never test it to the extent of what it can be tested. It's infinite. But you can disprove it once. It only takes that one time. So it's a key concept. How do we keep checking and testing the hypothesis? And when I'm talking about hypothesis, the hypothesis is in the business case. If we build this deliverable, we will get this outcome. So that's the hypothesis that we need to keep checking. The reason I talk about it as hypothesis is it actually invites more active, less passive involvement. Another thing I'd suggest is what's an exit strategy. So if you go in with the anticipation that at any point you should be able to choose to exit from this particular project investment, it changes your design, it changes your contracting approach, because you're anticipating the risk or the potential that you may need to step away. It could potentially change how you design, in that you might build, and this is where an agile or iterative approach really helps, is you're building the sequential set of values. So if you design these exit points where you can intelligently reuse whatever you've created to that point, or stop at that point. Now, like we've built a hospital, but it's actually based on a 4-quadrant, and they've built 1 quadrant. And as that builds and as it demonstrates its value, we then just start flipping and mirroring across the rest of the quadrant. So they've just built the first quarter to test the theory. Also being very mindful of who will own this for the next 5 to 10 years or more, depending on the capability. So again, I was talking to someone from Australian Defence, and we were discussing the challenge of having a capability that they're working on that could be 20 or 30 years before it's delivered. Who's going to own that? Who's going to keep an eye of sight on why that was agreed to, what benefit that capability is meant to bring? Very challenging, that kind of short-termism versus long-term view. So who's going to be the storyteller that remembers why you did something to continue monitoring and tracking and tweaking to make sure you get value? Now, as we move through, I'm suggesting across each of these stages, and it fits naturally with some forms of gating frameworks, is continually asking, you know, at that corporate portfolio governance level, is this still a great project? Is it still a right project? How confident are we that the output will give us the benefit? What's the threshold for our benefits? So we start off expecting to get the full suite of benefits, but then we start to creep back. You know, what's your, is it 90% of the anticipated? Is it 80%? What's the point where you say, that's gone red, we need to halt or redirect? So continually, how are we testing our benefits hypothesis? How are we disproving it? Has anything changed? And again, what's the exit strategy? And this doesn't stop as we get to the closure and handover. Continually asking those questions. Then we also need to be asking ourselves towards the end, what did we overlook? What, you know, this is around knowledge management and learning and being a learning organisation. So what is it that we need to go back and change, or just make sure that we change about our process in future? And then feeding that back to strategy. Okay. So I've sort of summarised that. So we've talked about these various forces, and what I'm suggesting is PMOs use process to throw the influence towards the organisational culture, particularly around how decisions are made. That ultimately does have a flow-on effect to people and environment, but we don't have the greatest power to change the environment or change people. This is the greatest capability we have. If you are working in a PMO world where you do have ability and accountability for growing people, for your talent management, for your capability, fantastic, because that's where you can bring these kinds of conversations and bring in another level of influence to that decision making. So what I'm suggesting is find ways to disrupt the unconscious, normal, natural human behaviour. Design governance to be more active, to engage the brain more. Be very cognizant about what your benefits threshold is and continually test that. Know what your tolerance is, what's your hurdle rate, now what's your value for the risk, and knowing when it's time to correct or pull the pin. To me, that's a success. So what I'm suggesting, folks, is if you consider all those and start making tweaks and you get the chance to sit back and watch that over the next few years, I believe that you will see culture shift and you will get to harvest more and more benefits. So that's me, and this is the point where you get to jump in and offer thoughts or maybe ask further questions. So I'm going to ask Mariah if she'd like to start ordering those for us.
Yep, thanks so much for that. I love the different perspectives of studying people. So the people that know me well would totally get that this resonates for me. We did have a couple of questions. One is, can you give some more information about what you think should be or even shouldn't be in an exit strategy?
It's going to depend on what the nature of the project is. Much trickier with big capital builds. They don't lend themselves for early exit points, but that's not always the case. So if we think about something very tangible to all of us, like if we're getting a house built, we might want to push towards having the shed put up first with some wiring in so there's some lights. So if I need to move in and hold out for a while, I've got that ability. So if I feel like the house build's not going great or funding's not coming in, I can halt the house build because I can at least get my garage to lock up. And I need to make sure, if that's going to be my strategy, I need to make sure that how I contract with the builder allows me to do that. So it builds in some decision points and some measures, etc. Certainly with a lot of IT vendors, I would definitely want to be sure that we've built in the points where we can step away mutually, where we've got good quality measures and agreed outcomes. Because I want to be, more and more, we're hearing the conversation around agility. And when I'm talking about agile and agility, when I say it, I mean with a lowercase a. I'm not talking about a very specific methodology. I'm just talking about the ability to say, you know what, let's halt this idea because it's not actually going to work for us, or the world's changed. And we can't do that unless we've got kind of the right level of governance in place. So you can't turn a big ship around unless you've got really good responsive engineering. So if we lock ourselves into a 3 or 5 year contract, we make it very hard for either side to step away. We make it very expensive and often ends up in all sorts of litigation. Whereas if we say, you know what, we're going to do this first stage, we're going to do a proof of concept, we're going to trial this, and then we're going to do the next rollout and test it with this audience. We want to see, you know, what our consumers think of it, and does it work, and does it, you know, and then we might come back and redesign it. But again, that whole contracting and planning design needs to allow for that. So I'll give you another example. If I'm using that kind of approach to design an education package, I might contract to have just the fundamentals, the pieces that I might need to meet or to have within my education package to meet the National Training Authority's requirements. But I have a whole bunch of other things that I also want to do. So again, I'm using this kind of agility, but I'm going to contract with the developer to just do the core. And then I want to see if I have people who want to enroll in this before I then move on to then contract to have these other pieces. So when we start breaking it down to the things that we talk about often, it kind of makes sense, but we don't look at our big project ideas and think to ourselves, what are the points where this could go haywire and how do I get out of it? So I think if you just think about your own world, pick a project and take that kind of risk-averse approach where you can step away, save invested or sunk costs, still have some value if possible, but not have the organisation committed to a long-term spend. Does that answer the question?
Yep, I think it does.
I might have over-answered it.
So another question that we had was earlier on in the presentation, you talked about the red dwarfs. And can you talk about like the most challenging red dwarf you've had and any tips? And before I do that, I just want to make sure everybody knows if you want to, if you haven't figured out how to ask a question, it's just, I think down towards the bottom. Or no, actually in the top left corner, it says Q&A. So you can just type it there if you have any other questions, for those of you who haven't. But anyway, so back to the most challenging type of red dwarf and any tips for working with them.
Oh, you know, I got asked yesterday, what's my greatest area of development? And I actually mentioned this theory. And I said, I think my greatest area of development is working out how to tackle red dwarfs. So I think it's something that is an ongoing thing for me, and every red dwarf is quite individual. It's the challenging ones are when they're in very senior roles and they have a detrimental effect, and working out how to harness that. So I guess I'm thinking of some examples over the years where an executive sponsor has been the great ideas person without the discipline to follow through. So, like, okay, so take that one a bit further. What I did with the framework here was write in how we use an expert to then sponsor a project to pass over to this kind of business owner. So we're then utilising someone who was very familiar with managing scope and, you know, all those classics of project stuff. So that it took this person's great ideas, but we didn't bring them from the business into actually guiding this through. So I designed a framework that kind of worked around that a little bit. It's not really ideal generally because, you know, I like the idea of the business owners having a lot to do with guiding a project. It is very challenging. Some we've managed with providing some really good steps of structure, but often they're people that just, their brains don't engage with process. So from there, it's in a degree of how well you can talk to them and what their level of self-awareness is. So the ones that are self-aware, that that's how they function, much easier.
Yeah.
Yeah. So lots of respect and caution, and not expecting everyone to have the same skill set because we are all very, very different. So the best ones for me are those who have that level of awareness to know that then they need to engage their shadow. So they need to recruit the person to work beside them that has all those skills that they don't have the strengths in.
Great. And if I were to add on to that, what book or books have you read that would help expand on what you've spoken about today, Chris?
I think that one, I would definitely start with the neuroscience. I'd play around with that a little bit because it is about understanding how your brain functions and how other people's brains function, and then some of the language and approaches. Yeah, I think social psychology is helpful, but just something like a bit of neuroscience. Brain at Work is a really good read.
Who wrote that?
Sorry, what was that?
Who wrote that?
I would actually have to Google that because I've gone blank.
Okay, you do that. I'm gonna ask you another question, and then maybe I'll Google it quickly. The question is, who should own the benefits realization plan?
Excellent question. So that PMO Symposium that I was recently at in San Diego, the core theme was around benefits management. And we had a number of interactive, what we call knowledge hubs. A really neat concept if anyone wants to follow up with me. But basically we'd have for an hour a group of maybe 10 folks, and we'd bounce things around. And one of the ones that kept repeating was on exactly this topic: who owns benefits? And the fundamental answer was it depends. It depends on your organization and what structure you have. Some really good enterprise PMOs that are part of the permanent organization, so not ones that have been set up just to deliver specific things, but are actually part of growing future capability. They can potentially be not so much the owner, but the owner of the process, the storyteller that helps bring that across. Look, some organizations, honestly, it probably is the CFO because it is a very financially driven, value back to the stakeholders kind of an organization. Some organizations, and if very little of this in Australia, but this is more globally, have a chief project officer who has that role about growing capability and focus on those benefits and value. So that's an interesting function. It doesn't necessarily have to be an executive role, but at least near executive in good oversight. And then many do it by stealth. So we're seeing IT PMOs or other sort of subgroup kind of portfolio areas are just doing it. They're just doing it quietly and growing the capability and the language, and that's all cool. There's many variants.
Yep. Okay. If there's not any other questions, I did look up the book, Brain at Work. It's by David Rock. That's who I thought it was, but I wasn't positive enough to answer. So anyway, I want to just say thank you so much, Chris. Thanks for everybody that participated, and we'll be sending out a recording. We'll send it out to everybody, so if you miss something or you want to re-review something, you'll have that. And I just don't have anything other to say than thanks so much, Chris. Appreciate your time and your energy.
No problem. And I'd love to hear from people if they actually sort of go away and play with any of the ideas from today. I'd be keen to hear the feedback.
Thanks so much. All right.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.